Hello students, we know that Indian society is a diverse society, and not only is it diverse, the diversity is complicated and complex because various segments of the population have been victims of age-old scourge of caste and other unfair practices which have been entrenched in India. And that is why from the early days of India's independence, the logic and the need for affirmative action was accepted by our policymakers. The welfare regime and social policy in India today have to be viewed in the context of the overall orientation of and shifts in state policy and government since India's independence. An interventionist and developmental state was seen right from the beginning as essential to achieve the stated aims of the directive principles of state policy and the removal of poverty, social injustice, and the march towards self-reliance and growth. The principles formulated included free and compulsory education for children, a public healthcare system and higher education system, economic and social rights to women, as well as the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes and other backward classes and religious minorities, along with adequate means of livelihood for all citizens. With the age of reforms dawning in India, we see that India has a history of detailed and diverse social policy programs. After the neoliberal reforms, there was a further and clear shift in advocating private sector expansion in health, education, and other social services, and the denial of state responsibility in these areas, even for the needy and poor groups, with the levying of user fees. So does it mean that the initial role that India had embraced at the time of independence got compromised with the age of liberalization? The gradual withdrawal of the state, with a slight upturn in the last few years, and its ad hoc treatment of the social sector are reflected in the trends in social sector expenditure. The playing field becomes even more uneven, clearly buttressing the need for affirmative action on part of the state. In other words, the need for affirmative action on part of the state is felt more than ever before in India, as liberalization has ended up with so many losers and a few winners. The scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, which together constitute a quarter of the total population, have long suffered from discrimination and exclusion. This is reflected in a lack of access to income-earning assets, higher quality employment, and public services. They also experience resistance, violence, and even atrocities in their attempts to secure human rights and lawful entitlements. This discrimination and exclusion experienced by the groups has resulted in severe deprivation and poverty. But what exactly is affirmative action? Affirmative action is a policy in which an individual's color, race, sex, religion, or national origin are taken into account to increase opportunities provided to an unprecedented and unrepresented part of society. Affirmative action policies in India are operative in three main spheres, namely appointment and promotion in government services, admission to public education institutions, and seats in the legislature. The purpose of affirmative action is to establish fair access to employment, opportunities to create a workforce that reflect the demography of the qualified available workforce in the relevant job market. What is the goal of affirmative action? Affirmative action has been at the heart of public policies aimed at uplift of the socially disadvantaged in India. Affirmative action incorporates some features from two distinct British concepts of positive discrimination and positive action. It is a set of policies that support members of disadvantaged groups that may have suffered discrimination in the past or future in areas like education, employment, and housing. For example, Affirmative action in the case of women would include policies and programs whereby additional efforts are made to recruit, hire, and promote qualified women, minorities, and individuals with disabilities. We can trace the sources of affirmative action in India to the Constitution itself. Part 16 deals with reservations of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in central and state legislatures. Articles 15 and 16 of the Constitution enable the state and central governments to reserve seats in government services for the members of the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. The Constitution was amended by the 77th Amendment Act 1995, and a new clause was inserted in Article 16 to enable the government to provide reservation in promotion. Later, Clause 4A was modified by the 85th Constitutional Amendment Act 2001 to provide consequential seniority to scheduled caste and scheduled tribe candidates promoted by giving reservation. Constitutional 81st Amendment Act 2000 inserted Article 16, Clause 4B, which enables the state to fill the unfilled vacancies of a year which are reserved for scheduled caste, scheduled tribes in the succeeding year, thereby nullifying the ceiling of 50% reservation on the total number of vacancies that year. Reservation of seats in representative bodies is an important aspect of affirmative action. Article 330 and 332 provide for specific representation through reservation of seats for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the Parliament and in the state legislative assemblies respectively. Article 243 provides reservation of seats for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in every panchayat. Article 335 of the Constitution says that the claims of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes shall be taken into consideration constituently with the maintenance of efficacy of the administration, while Article 233 provides reservation of seats for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in every municipality. So, reservation of seats in representative bodies is enshrined in the Constitution itself. After independence, initially, reservations were provided only for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. The other backward classes were included in the ambit of the reservation in 1991 on the recommendations of the Mondal Commission. In fact, in exercise of the powers conferred by Article 340 of the Constitution, the President appointed a backward class commission in December 1978 under the chairmanship of B.P. Mondal. The commission was formed to determine the criteria for defining India's socially and educationally backward classes and to recommend steps to be taken for the advancement of these backward classes. The Mondal Commission concluded that India's population consisted of approximately 52% of other backward classes, therefore 27% of jobs should be reserved for them. The Commission has developed 11 indicators of social, educational, and economic backwardness. Apart from identifying backward classes among Hindus, the Commission has also identified backward classes among non-Hindus like the Muslims, the Sikhs, the Christians, and the Buddhists. It has generated an All India Other Backward Classes list of 3743 castes and a more underprivileged depressed backward classes list containing another 2,108 castes. In the Indra Sawhney case of 1992, the Supreme Court, while upholding the 27% quota for backward classes, struck down the government notification reserving 10% government jobs for economically backward classes among the higher castes. The Supreme Court in the same case also upheld the principle that the combined reservation beneficiaries should not exceed 50% of India's population. One of the important aspects of affirmative action is visible in the respect of reservation in government services. The most important aspect of the reservation policy is that relating to government services in India. Article 16, Clause 4 of the Constitution empowers the state to make any provisions for the reservation in appointments or posts in favor of any backward class of citizens, and provision for reservation in matters of promotion to any class or classes of posts in the services under the state in favor of the SCs and STs. In pursuing this provision, the government made reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in proportion to their share of population. There are also reservations in the promotion of employed persons. The government services included are the government civil service, public sector undertakings, statutory and semi-government bodies, and voluntary agencies which are under the control of the government or which receive governmental aids. At the central level, some services are, however, excluded from the reservation policy, and these include prominently the defense and the judiciary. But along with such provisions, there are also supportive measures accompanying reservation. Reservation is accompanied by other provisions designed to increase the ability of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes to compete for government jobs. These include the relaxation of minimum age for entry into the service, relaxation in the minimum standard of suitability subject to a required minimum qualification, of course, and the provision of pre-examination training, separate interviews for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and representation of people with scheduled caste or scheduled tribe backgrounds on select committees. There is also affirmative action in India in the realm of education. The second most important aspect of reservation policy relates to education. Article 15, Clause 4 of the Constitution empowers the state to make special provisions for the educational achievements and advancement of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. In pursuing this provision, the state reserves place for scheduled castes and scheduled tribe students in educational institutions, including all colleges run by the central or the state governments and all government-aided educational institutions. This is supported by a number of financial schemes, including scholarships, special hostels for scheduled castes and scheduled tribe students, fee concessions, grants for books, and additional coaching. Political representation is also taken care of by the ambit of affirmative action in India. In fact, the third most important sphere of the reservation policy relates to representation in central and state legislatures. Under Articles 330, 332 and 334 of the Constitutions, seats are reserved for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the central legislature and state legislatures. Similar reservations are provided in local bodies at district, taluk and village levels. The reservation of seats is complemented by statutory provisions to enhance political participation by scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Non-scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, smaller election deposits are required from members of these groups, for example. But there are problems in implementing policies of affirmative action in India. The formal reservation policy in the government sector and the general developmental and empowerment measures in the private sector has also contributed to an improvement in the human development of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But despite this impressive achievement, there are problems. During the course of the implementation of India's reservation policy, these problems have come to surface. First, the success of the policy has been uneven across sectors and departments. Second, the policy is limited to the government sector, while more than 90% of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe workers are employed in the private sector. And finally, despite the improvement in human development among scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, disparities in attainment with non-scheduled castes and non-scheduled tribes persist even to this day. This indicates that addressing social exclusion in India is often a far more difficult challenge than addressing poverty issues. The case of affirmative action is aptly borne out by promising legislation, as in the case of the Forest Rights Act. We have seen that the marginalized in India experience resistance, violence, and even atrocities in their attempts to secure human rights and lawful entitlements, including property. The Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act, enacted by the Indian Parliament 2006, did not emerge from unproblematic and consensual deliberations. Rather, The struggle to pass the act and to keep the key elements intact was fraught with intense contestation. Central to the process of policy development in this case has been the use of collective pressure through an unusual coalition of interests spread across the states of India, which ultimately paved the road to the new institutional settlement. We have already seen that among the vulnerable groups in India, the tribes probably are the foremost. Policies must emerge from specific contexts. The history of tribes and other forest dwellers inhabiting this part of the South Asian continent is a history of exploitation and extortion that has continued for ages, assuming particular intensity during the days of British colonial rule in India. But during the post-independence period, the scheduled tribes were provided with certain constitutional safeguards, including reservation in government jobs, besides a separate administrative structure. Okay, by separate administrative structure, I mean under the 6th schedule of the Constitution, the entire state has a different set of governance provisions provided that state is inhabited predominantly by scheduled tribes. There is also the 5th schedule, which is applicable at the district level, and it provides for administration and control of scheduled areas falling under Schedule 5, and it gives powers to the governors to make regulations for peace and good governance of the scheduled areas inhabited by scheduled tribes. So affirmative action for depressed sections have been conceived by the Constitution itself. But despite these provisions in the Constitution extending affirmative action in favor of depressed sections like the tribes, their position remains insecure because they are subjected to various threats. The march of independent India in the direction of industrialization and progress spawned a new set of threats for the tribals and the forest dwellers, who now have become pawns ready to be sacrificed at the altar of development and modernization. We hear numerous tales of displacement of tribals because of the construction of some dam or because of some mining which is necessary for setting up a particular industry. There are numerous cases where the usurpation of tribal lands is overlooked by a largely non-tribal government that accepts tribal people's displacement as a necessary condition of development. Tribal peoples have also felt threatened, and their lands have been usurped by the Indian state through its various laws for forest conservation. Environmental protection, in fact, has conflicted in a big way with tribal rights. In 1976, provisions were inserted into the Constitution that imposed responsibilities on both the state and the citizens to protect the environment. The directive principles of state policy enshrined in Part 4 of the Constitution provides in Article 48A that the state shall endeavour to protect and improve the environment and to safeguard the forests and wildlife of the country. There ensued a spate of notifications of national parks and sanctuaries seeking to protect and preserve India's wildlife and their habitat. The Department of Environment was established in India in 1980 for the purpose of ensuring a clean and healthy environment for the country. It was subsequently upgraded to become the Ministry of Environment and Forests in 1985. Consequently, the traditional use, and this is where the whole issue of conflict between the governmental quest for protecting environment and protecting the rights of tribals gets into a messy situation. The traditional users of land were being increasingly restricted in their access to what has sustained them for centuries. These people were increasingly looked upon as encroachers. So just imagine people who have been inhabitants of soil, have been residing in a particular land for generations. The Adivasis, as they are called, they were suddenly turned into encroachers. The poverty of the tribals renders them vulnerable. So where is the significance of the FRA? The FRA is important in an age of globalization when India, along with its pursuit of higher economic growth, must also display both nationally and internationally its concern for and commitment to the plight of the poor and the marginalized sections of the population. The skeptics further argue that visibly engaged in the path of development as India is today, contemplation and implementation of various developmental projects for mining, dams, establishment of specific economic zones, etc. will be on the rise. And that can only mean that there will be more cases of displacement, leading to further expropriation and pauperization of the non-elite rural people, the tribals. So, in these circumstances, definitely the legislation of the Forest Rights Act is a victory for the marginalized tribals. There are those who therefore feel that the FRA is a commendable and a rare case of politically marginalized groups like the forest-dwelling tribals and the forest-dependent poor extracting a concession from the political elite. It could well be an indication that the politicized poor are becoming increasingly influential, that they are becoming more capable in terms of defending and extending their autonomous spaces within India's political economy. Their economic security or pauperization in the days to come will depend to a large extent upon their ability to safeguard and protect both their private and their common property on which their livelihood depends. So, the Forest Rights Act definitely sensitizes to the state to its welfare commitment. Bordone notes that in many parts of India, the poor have started questioning with slowly growing assertiveness what has been one of history's most well-entrenched and ornately elaborate ideological systems of legitimizing inequality and exploitation. This questioning becomes more acute with the expansion of the market nexus. So, liberalization sensitizes us more and more to the fact that if you treat unequals equally, the result can only mean greater inequality. So, even in situations where the state is apt to neglect its welfare commitment, such turmoil from below and messy politics in an open and burgeoning polity like India can go a long way in prodding the state to live up to its promises to the poor and ensure the welfare of the marginalized. The case of the emergence of the Forest Rights Act bears testimony to this fact. So, we accept that affirmative action is a necessity, but perhaps it is not sufficient. Currently, the affirmative action policies apply to government and government-supported sectors only and exclude the private sector. However, it is estimated that more than 90% of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe workers are employed in the private sector, and there is a danger that such workers lack protection against discrimination, which we have been trying to address from the whole perspective of affirmative action. Similarly, all private educational institutions are also excluded from the reservation policy. The government has set up a group of ministers to develop a consensus between the government and the private sector regarding the adoption of affirmative action policies in the private sector as well. So, one has to be conscious about the loopholes in affirmative action. The goal of affirmative action policy in India has been to bring about an improvement in the welfare for those who historically have been economically and socially depressed and marginalized. But in arriving at this judgment about who should be eligible for reservation, the criteria has been a person's caste rather than his income or wealth. Consequently, groups belonging to what Article 115 of the Indian Constitution calls socially and educationally backward classes have benefited from reservations, even though in practice many of these groups could not be regarded as backward. This has meant that many of the benefits of reservation have been captured by well-off groups from the depressed classes. For example, the Chamars from the scheduled castes, while poorer groups from the depressed, for example, Bhangis from the scheduled castes, have failed to benefit. Does affirmative action amount to reverse discrimination? To many, it does. Reverse discrimination is the inevitable consequence of reservation, is what they would argue. But there is a view, especially among the upper caste, that they are benefiting a generation whose parents have already moved up in the social structure and have been able to give them benefits denied to other much poorer and more remote young people. There is also belief that unqualified students are displacing highly qualified students in the race to the top of the educational pyramid. Many who share this view argue that the application of reservations will destroy the competitiveness of the Indian economy and drive away foreign investors because of the privileges ensured by reservation. But we believe that ultimately all arguments against affirmative action or reservation are misplaced and misunderstood. Advocates of reservation argue that the most powerful special privileges accrue actually to high caste Hindus who can tap into exclusive social networks, bank on the cultural capital their families leave behind for them, or pay the bribes that are demanded by employers for access to jobs. Dalits from remote areas are themselves doubly disadvantaged. How? They are disadvantaged by caste bias that prevails in society and by the dreaded scourge of poverty which continues to ail their lives. They struggle out of rural areas burdened by social isolation, ill-equipped in terms of cultural capital to navigate in an urban metropolis or the national capital, for they lack social networks that more privileged castes often count on. Therefore, the importance of affirmative action cannot be overemphasized. It remains an important and a valid and a necessary intervention. The fact that disparities in attainment persist to this day indicates that addressing social exclusion is often a far more difficult challenge than anti-poverty policy, but its necessity is not to be questioned. Social and cultural sources of exclusion, including low self-esteem, stigma, discrimination, and denial of citizenship, are rooted in the social structure and the institutions of caste and untouchability, which have been dreaded scourges in our society. As long as such injustice persists, reservations will be needed. The policy levels the playing field at the vital choke points of social mobility. So, the need for affirmative action was never more necessary nor more evident. Thank you.